August of 1977, Brenda Parsh flew from Wisconsin to Cape Girardeau, Missouri, where her parents lived. Her father was hospitalized and recovering from surgery. Brenda was born June 28, 1950, to Floyd and Mary Parsh. She was beautiful and vivacious, becoming a cheerleader in high school. She later became a beauty queen in a pageant in Cape Girardeau. She had ambitions to work in the fashion industry, moving to Wisconsin to be a fashion buyer. As her career was just taking off, this beautiful woman was ripped from the world in a savage attack that also claimed her mother. Mary Evelyn Alexander Parsh was born April 13, 1919, in Alton, Illinois. She married Floyd Parsh, and together they had 2 daughters. Brenda was the youngest daughter of the couple. Mary was a loving mother and wife. On Friday, August 12, 1977, Mary Parsh left her husband at the hospital to pick up Brenda from the airport. Floyd Parsh said after his wife and daughter failed to show up at the hospital, he called the house. He said Brenda answered but seemed upset and distracted. She said, "I love you, Daddy," and then hung up the phone. That was the last time Floyd talked to his daughter. After 3 days of failing to show up at the hospital, a neighbor went to check on Mary and Brenda Parsh. The neighbor found Brenda and Mary lying face down on the master bed with their hands bound behind their backs. They were both nude and deceased from gunshot wounds. Their bodies had been lying in the house, which did not have air conditioning, for 3 days in the summer heat. The bodies were already partially decomposed. Authorities believed that the killer must have known the victims. Floyd was hospitalized, so he was quickly eliminated as a suspect. A small caliber slug was recovered from the head of Mary Parsh, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, 1977. Although several items seemed to have been rummaged through, nothing of value was missing. The keys to the house were still in the front door, suggesting the women had been ambushed upon returning home. Detectives suspected that Brenda's ex-boyfriend, whom she just broke up with before moving to Wisconsin, may have been responsible. However, no evidence linked him to the crime. There were also rumors about Brenda's brother-in-law making inappropriate advances towards Brenda. Both men were interrogated, but no evidence linked either man to the crime, and both had alibis. The case went cold. On November 17, 1977, 21-year-old Sheila Ellen Cole was found dead in a roadside bathroom stall of Illinois Highway 3 near McClure, Illinois. She had been shot twice in the head. Her autopsy showed no signs of sexual assault, and she did not appear to have been robbed. In fact, her wallet was nearby with cash and checks still inside. There was no suspects or evidence to lead to a suspect in the case. Her case also went cold. Sheila was born on September 15, 1956, in the Crestwood, Missouri area to Harold and Naomi Cole. She was a 1974 graduate of Lindbergh High School and was attending Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau. She was studying zoology and chemistry, planning to enter graduate school to study marine biology the following year, Manny's, J. 1977. The night before her body was found, Sheila had dinner with her boyfriend and then told her roommate she was going to Walmart and Schnucks. No one knew why she was in Illinois. On May 12, 1978, David Witt called police and said his wife had been murdered. When police arrived at the couple's Marion, Illinois home, they found 51-year-old Virginia Witt deceased, lying nude on her bed. Initial observation of the scene indicated that Mrs. Witt had a large wound in her abdomen, apparently caused by a knife slash, and she also had a knife protruding from her chest, Williamson County Detective Keith Odom said, Callison, 1978. An autopsy determined she died of a combination of choking and stabbing. Virginia Witt was born on August 6, 1926. She married David Witt, and the couple were longtime residents of St. Joseph, Missouri. Virginia worked as a dormitory housing clerk at Missouri Western State College before she and her husband moved to Illinois. She had been grocery shopping the morning of her murder, and groceries were still lying on the counter when her husband, a Ford Motor Company executive, found her deceased. On March 23, 1979, the nude deceased body of 29-year-old Joyce Faye Tharp was found behind a church in Paducah, Kentucky. Her body was found by a florist delivering flowers to the church after she had been reported missing the day before. Her family reported her missing after finding a window broken at her apartment, and Joyce was nowhere to be found. An autopsy determined the cause of death to be blunt force trauma to the head and strangulation. She had bruises to her head and neck. She was found nude, suggesting sexual assault. Joyce's case also went cold. Myrtle V. Rupp was found deceased in her Muhlenberg Township, Pennsylvania home on April 17, 1979. The 51-year-old woman had been strangled and her arms and wrists were bound with cord. Mrs. Rupp was discovered by a neighbor after no one had seen her in a few days. An autopsy determined that Myrtle died from strangulation and had also been sexually assaulted. There were no suspects in this case either, and it would eventually grow cold. Myrtle V. Rupp was born on April 4, 1928. She married Charles Rupp, but he preceded her in death in 1974. Myrtle was a registered nurse, working as the head nurse and supervisor in the obstetrics and gynecology department at Community General Hospital in Reading, Pennsylvania, Republican and Herald, 1979. 72-year-old Ida White was found with multiple stab wounds on September 7, 1981, in Mount Vernon, Illinois. She was transported to the hospital in serious condition. Her neighbor had heard her screams and came to Ida's home. The elderly woman was in her bathtub with multiple stab wounds to her abdomen. The neighbor saw the perpetrator leave through the bathroom window. Ida later died at the hospital from her injuries. The neighbor described the perpetrator as a black male with a rough face and facial hair. Police were quick to identify a suspect. A man named Grover Thompson was found sleeping across the street at the local post office. He was taken in for questioning and put in a lineup. The lineup was mishandled as Grover was the only suspect shown to the witness. The witness reluctantly identified him, although his clothing did not match the description. There were other issues with the case. Grover had a disabled leg, yet authorities believed he had jumped out of the window and down 5 feet. Grover Thompson was a resident of Miami, Florida. He had been traveling from his sister's home in Wisconsin to Mississippi at the time. He stopped in Mount Vernon to rest, falling asleep in the post office lobby. Despite the lack of evidence, Grover Thompson was tried and convicted of the murder of Ida White. She was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Grover died in prison in 1996. Margie Call was found deceased in her Cape Girardeau, Missouri, home on January 27, 1982. She was 57 years old. She has been shot with a .38 caliber weapon after being sexually assaulted. It appeared as if the perpetrator had entered her home through a window. The autopsy showed that her cause of death was strangulation, despite the gunshot wound. United Press International, 1982. Margie Louise Call was born July 8, 1924, in Cape Girardeau. She was a bookkeeper for F.W. Woolworth Company for 30 years. She married Ernest Call in 1947 and he preceded her in death in 1978. She was survived by 2 sons, both living in southern Illinois. There was a suspect in Margie's case, but this person was ruled out before the year was over. Blood evidence was found at the scene, but with no suspect to compare it to, the case went cold. On April 8, 1982, the body of 23-year-old Deborah Renee Shepard was found in her Carbondale, Illinois, apartment. Deborah was one of several young women murdered in the Carbondale area around that time, igniting fear of a serial killer in the area. However, the Carbondale police said there is no connection with any other cases. Wolf, 1982. Deborah was found with no obvious signs of trauma, and police originally believed no foul play was involved. In fact, they suggested she may have died of a drug overdose. Her first autopsy, performed in southern Illinois, documented pulmonary edema as the cause of death. Wolf, 1982. However, her family was skeptical and believed that a second autopsy was necessary. It was performed in Chicago before her burial. The second autopsy determined strangulation to be the cause of death. When police originally processed the scene, they noted fluid released from Deborah's mouth that was collected on a piece of clothing nearby. The detectives collected that piece of clothing in hopes that the biological evidence may one day be useful in this case. An article in the Kenosha News in 1982 details the Shepherd family's fight to have their daughter's case ruled a homicide. Police were lax in investigating the young woman's death because they didn't want publicity about another unsolved slaying near the school. Kenosha News, 1982. According to the article, Cook County Medical Examiner found evidence of strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. Eventually, a coroner's inquest hearing resulted in the death being ruled a homicide. Despite the case being ruled a homicide, detectives were no closer to solving the murder. The murders of several other young women were linked to serial killer John Paul Phillips, but no evidence linked Phillips to Deborah's murder. The case grew cold. On June 21, 1982, Mildred Wallace was found deceased in her Cape Girardeau home. Mildred had been shot with a .32 caliber weapon, much the same as Margie Call. She had also been sexually assaulted. Her cause of death was ruled to be a gunshot wound to the head. Mrs. Wallace had been blindfolded and her hands tied behind her back. Police found a window in her bathroom that appeared to be the entrance point for the intruder. She was found by her sister when the 65-year-old failed to show up for work. Police quickly connected Mildred Wallace's murder to that of Margie Call. However, they were no closer to identifying the perpetrator. For the benefit of this entire area, the offender or offenders must be apprehended and all the legal means to accomplish this task must be utilized, Judge A.J. Sear said, Associated Press, 1982. Although no killer was identified, the crimes just suddenly stopped. In 2007, Carbondale police decided to take another look at the murder of Deborah Shepherd. They ran forensic testing on the shirt obtained from the scene on which the fluids from her mouth were collected. The testing revealed a male DNA profile, suggesting an oral sexual assault had occurred. More shocking, the DNA profile was matched to a man who had been in prison since 1983, Timothy Crotcher. Timothy was born Timothy Wayne McBride on November 28, 1944, in West Monoy Township, Pennsylvania. His father abandoned him and his mother, so Timothy's mother Fern raised him by herself. She dated frequently and eventually met Bernie Crotcher. Fern married Bernie and he legally adopted Timothy, changing his name to Timothy Crotcher. At age 5, Timothy broke into a neighbor's house. While inside, he destroyed property within the home. He then urinated on the floor. It was a shocking crime demonstrating extreme emotional disturbances in a 5-year-old boy. At age 6, he was arrested for petty theft of a bicycle. As a young man, Timothy became obsessed sexually with his mother. He also began peeping on neighbors, demonstrating an obsession with voyeurism and exhibitionism. Timothy enlisted in the United States Navy and was in basic training when he met a woman named Barbara. When Barbara became pregnant, Timothy and Barbara married. Timothy was 18 years old when his daughter Charlotte was born in 1963. However, Charlotte would never meet her father as he was in jail for a heinous crime already. In May of 1963, Timothy raped and stabbed a woman using scissors in Waukegan, Illinois. The woman survived, and Timothy raped another victim. He was arrested and charged with the rape. While awaiting trial, Barbara left him and gave birth to their daughter. Timothy was convicted and sentenced to 25 to 50 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. Timothy obtained an associate degree while in prison and began working as an inmate emergency medical technician at Cairo Paco Community Hospital in 1974. He also worked for Union County Hospital in Anna, Illinois as an inmate EMT in 1975. He was released from prison in 1976 due to good behavior and was described as a model inmate. Upon his release, he began classes at Southern Illinois University and moved to Carbondale, Illinois. He began working as an ambulance driver with the Jackson County Ambulance. After his release, Timothy began committing numerous burglaries, home invasions, and sexual assaults. During one of these home invasions in 1977, Timothy stole a .38 caliber pistol. He was never suspected of any of those burglaries and continued to work as a first responder. However, in 1979 he was arrested for molesting a 13-year-old girl, his landlord's daughter. He was sentenced to 2 years for the crime in August of 1979. He was released from prison in 1981. After his second release in 1981, Timothy earned a bachelor's degree in administration of justice from Southern Illinois University, where he minored in psychology. He later stated that his studies made him a better criminal. He would continue to commit various rapes, although he was never a suspect. He was arrested in 1983 in Allentown, Pennsylvania, when someone reported a suspicious man in the parking lot. He was found with a gun and arrested on a firearms charge. He attempted to escape the Pennsylvania prison that same year, breaking his leg during the attempt. He was convicted of assault and sentenced to 5 years. Upon his release from the Pennsylvania prison in 1988, Crotcher was transferred to Big Muddy Correctional Center in Southern Illinois to serve sentences for parole violations. He was civilly committed as a sexually dangerous person and confined under those terms in Illinois from 1989 to 2007, when DNA evidence linked him to the murder of Deborah Shepard. When police confronted Timothy Crotcher with the DNA evidence against him, he confessed to murdering Deborah Shepard in 1982. He said he broke in, attempted to force her to perform oral sex, and then strangled her to death. He was charged with first-degree murder and was awaiting trial. News of the cold case being solved after 25 years reached detectives in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. They wanted to speak with Timothy Crotcher. Crotcher initially denied any involvement in any other murders, including those occurring in Cape Girardeau. However, authorities agreed to not seek the death penalty in Missouri if Crotcher told the truth about his crimes. With that promise, he confessed to 9 murders, multiple sexual assaults, robberies, and assaults. He said that he didn't know why he chose the victims he did, but that he was more likely to kill the women who reminded him of his mother, explaining why he chose elderly women to murder in many cases. In December 2007, Timothy Crotcher was convicted of the murder of Deborah Shepard and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He was sent to a maximum security prison and classified as a serial killer. He was sentenced to 40 more years in 2008 for the murder of Virginia Witt. He was then given 13 life sentences in Missouri for the murders of Mary Parsh, Brenda Parsh, Sheila Cole, Margie Call, and Mildred Wallace. Sheila Cole had been murdered in Missouri before being dumped in McClure, Illinois, approximately 6 miles over the border. He confessed to the murder of Joyce Tharp in Kentucky and was also charged with the murder of Myrtle Rupp in Pennsylvania. He received another life sentence in Pennsylvania. After Crotcher's confession to the murder of Ida White, Grover Thompson received a posthumous exoneration from Governor Bruce Rauner. Timothy Crotcher is currently being held at the Pontiac Correctional Center in Illinois. Due to his 80-year Illinois sentence and his indefinite commitment as a sexually dangerous person, Timothy Crotcher does not have a release date. Upon his release in Illinois, he will be transferred to Missouri to serve 13 life sentences. Timothy Crotcher will die behind bars, but that doesn't seem to be enough of a punishment for the monstrous crimes he committed and the 10 lives he took. Before we move on to another story, put a like and subscribe to the channel. And do not forget to give me your opinion, this is important. We move now. On the fateful day of March 10, 1928, a young boy named Walter Collins vanished without a trace. Aged 9, his last sighting was approximately at 5 p.m., spotted by a neighbor at the intersection of Pasadena Avenue and North Avenue 23, nestled in the heart of Lincoln Heights, Los Angeles. Entrusted with a small sum by his mother, Christine Collins, he set off to indulge in an evening movie at a theater nearby. Meanwhile, his father was serving time for robbery at Folsom State Prison. The Los Angeles Police Department, already neck-deep in an investigation for several alleged corruption scandals, found Walter's disappearance to be a disconcerting dent to their reputation. Police Chief James Davis, bearing the brunt of the pressure, was tasked with unraveling the puzzle surrounding the boy's sudden disappearance. A desperate search around Lincoln Park Lake yielded no fruitful results. The boy's father, from behind the bars of his prison cell, pointed fingers at resentful prison inmates, believing their quest for vengeance to be the driving force behind his son's sudden vanishing act. Given his role in the prison's cafeteria, where he was responsible for monitoring and reporting fellow inmates' misconducts, it was plausible that he had rubbed some the wrong way. Despite a flurry of leads pouring in, none proved to be a significant breakthrough. A chilling account came from Richard Strothers, a gas station attendant in Glendale, who claimed to have seen a lifeless boy concealed in newspaper in the back seat of a car. This car belonged to a couple of foreign appearance who had paused to inquire about directions. C.V. Staley, a bystander, took it upon himself to tail the couple. After a brief stop outside the police station, they zoomed off, managing to lose Staley. When presented with Walter's photograph, both Strothers and Staley were positive that the boy in the car was indeed Walter. Other leads hinted at a couple journeying across the state with a captive boy pleading for freedom. Walter's disappearance was not an isolated incident during this period. Two other boys, Nelson and Lewis Winslow, aged 10 and 12 respectively, went mysteriously missing on May 16, 1928, while en route to their Pomona residence. A series of peculiar letters received by their parents added to the mystery. The first hinted at an impromptu trip to Mexico, and the second hinted at a bizarre desire to prolong their disappearance to attain fame. The authorities initially failed to perceive any correlation between the perplexing disappearances of Walter Collins and the Winslow boys. Similarly, they did not link these cases to the gruesome discovery of a decapitated Latino boy in La Puente earlier in February. Consequently, a report from a local about a man mistreating a boy on a poultry farm seemed unrelated. Fast forward to August 1928, when police in Illinois found a young boy identifying himself as Arthur Kent. Initially, he only confessed to being abandoned by his father, leading authorities to place him with a foster family. However, with time, he admitted his true identity as Walter Collins from Los Angeles, claiming he had been evasive to safeguard his father. Upon receiving this revelation, the Illinois police promptly contacted their California counterparts, forwarding the boy's photographs and, eventually, the boy himself to Los Angeles. Upon receiving the images, California officials reached out to Christine Collins, presenting her with pictures of the boy allegedly her son. Her immediate reaction was one of denial, insisting the boy was not her son. Yet Captain J.J. Jones persuaded her to take the boy in temporarily, promising to resolve the confusion. 3 weeks following this orchestrated reunion, Christine returned to the police station with the boy, armed with Walter's dental records and corroborated statements from those who knew Walter, attesting that the boy was an imposter. Rather than acknowledging the evidence, Captain Jones labeled her a madwoman, accusing her of attempting to pawn off her child onto the state and embarrass the police department. In a shocking turn of events, he had her committed to a psychiatric ward in Los Angeles County General Hospital under a Code 12 provision, a law that permitted the police to remove troublemakers by committing them to psychiatric institutions. In September of the same year, a startling piece of information emerged from a Canadian woman named Winifred Clark. She reached out to U.S. authorities, alleging that her nephew had abducted her son, Sanford Wesley Clark, and was holding him captive in California. Jessie Clark, worried for her 15-year-old brother, who had left 2 years earlier with their then 21-year-old uncle, Gordon Stewart Northcott, resolved to visit Northcott's ranch in Loinville, California to investigate. What she discovered during her brief stay was deeply unsettling. Her brother was being abused by their uncle, who seemed to be embroiled in something profoundly sinister. To her horror, she too became a target of her uncle's aggression. On the 15th day of September, 1928, a grim confession was extracted from Sanford. He divulged to investigators that his uncle, Northcott, had not only kidnapped him but subjected him to a horrifying ordeal of physical and sexual abuse. He further revealed his forced involvement in witnessing the torture and murder of Walter Collins, Nelson and Lewis Winslow, and several other boys, sometimes coerced into participating in these heinous acts. Northcott, he claimed, would kidnap boys, subject them to rape, and when his sadistic amusement waned, he would usher them into a room filled with hatching chicks, only to abruptly end their lives with an axe. In an attempt to erase his horrific deeds, Northcott would douse the victim's remains in quicklime. Sanford further implicated Northcott in the murder of a Latino boy in La Puente. According to him, Walter Collins was murdered because he had witnessed Northcott assist another man in killing his mining partner. Sanford pointed the police towards graves near the chicken coop, purportedly housing the remains of the Winslow brothers and Walter Collins. Indeed, 2 graves were uncovered, but they held only fragments of bone. Among other farming tools, axes stained with human blood and hair were discovered. The ranch was littered with scattered bones, later identified by pathologists as belonging to male children. Within the house, a library book borrowed in the name of one of the Winslow boys was found, alongside more letters penned to their parents. Other chilling discoveries included a child's whistle and several Boy Scout badges. However, no evidence specifically linked to Walter Collins was unearthed. Northcott's father, Cyrus George Northcott, came forward 2 days later, confessing that his son had admitted to the murders. But by then, Northcott and his mother, Louise Northcott, had fled the town. Los Angeles Police Department remained stubbornly insistent that Christine Collins had her son, a belief they only abandoned when a handwriting expert, brought in to analyze the writing styles, conclusively determined that the boy's handwriting did not match samples from earlier years. The distinctive R's in the boy's handwriting were indicative of an Illinois education, a style not taught in California. Eventually, the boy confessed. He admitted to assuming several other aliases, revealing that he had chosen to impersonate Walter Collins when someone mentioned a striking resemblance. Arthur Hutchins, a 12-year-old, had adopted Collins' identity in a whimsical bid to venture to Hollywood and meet his idol, the cowboy star, Tom Mix. His stepmother retrieved him from Los Angeles and escorted him back to their home in Illinois. Hutchins showed little remorse for his actions, insinuating that Christine Collins was aware that he wasn't her son, turning the situation into a strange game for both parties. Shortly after Hutchins' departure to his Illinois home, Christine Collins was liberated from the psychiatric institution. On the 20th of September 1928, the long arm of the law finally reached Gordon Stewart Northcott, apprehending him in British Columbia. His mother, Sarah Louise Northcott, was subsequently arrested in Alberta. In a bid to gather further information, the police escorted Northcott back to his infamous ranch in December. During this visit, he made a verbal confession to 5 murders, including those of the Winslow brothers, Walter Collins, and a Mexican boy named Alvin Gahi. However, later that day, he would pen a written confession acknowledging a single murder, that of Alvin Gahi. Meanwhile, in the same month, Northcott's mother made a shocking confession of her own. She admitted to the murder of Walter Collins, revealing she had struck the fatal blow before burying the boy near the chicken coop. According to Sanford Clark, his grandmother had coerced them into sharing the guilt by each striking the boy, thereby ensuring mutual culpability if they were ever apprehended. For her role in Walter Collins' murder, Sarah Louise Northcott was sentenced to life imprisonment. The trial of Gordon Stewart Northcott commenced in January 1929. Northcott, in a surprising move, dismissed several defense attorneys, opting to represent himself. He confessed to the sexual abuse of young boys, justifying his actions with a claim of love. His mother, called as a witness, dropped a bombshell, asserting that she was in fact his grandmother, the product of her husband's rape of their daughter, Winifred. Northcott also alleged an incestuous relationship with Sarah Louise and accused his father of molestation. His defense strategy was an unorthodox one, betraying his lack of legal expertise. Moreover, Sarah Louise's credibility as a witness was questionable, given her inconsistent statements and an evident willingness to do anything for Gordon. The trial concluded on February 8, 1929, with an all-male jury convicting Northcott of the first-degree murders of the Winslow brothers and an unidentified victim. Judge George R. Freeman handed down the death sentence. However, the sentencing brought little solace to the victims' families, who had no bodies to mourn. Northcott met his end on the gallows on October 2, 1930. His execution marked the end of the Wineville chicken coop murders, prompting the citizens to sever their connection to the gruesome past by changing the town's name to Mira Loma, translating to View from the Hill in Spanish. This renaming allowed the town to distance itself from the horrific legacy of Northcote's poultry farm. As we reach the conclusion of Twisted Tales, we are left with a chilling reminder of the depths of human depravity that can exist within the darkest corners of society. The stories of Timothy Crotcher and Gordon Northcote serve as haunting reminders of the fragility of life and the capacity for evil that can reside within even seemingly ordinary individuals. May their stories continue to serve as cautionary tales, urging us to remain vigilant and committed to justice, while striving to prevent such horrors from ever happening again. On the afternoon of Sunday, May 4, 1986, 18-year-old graduating senior Suzanne Harrison and her best friend Gina Lee Turner, 20, decided to spend the day at Lake Hawkins, a favorite hangout for the young and young at heart in the tight-knit Texas community of Hawkins. In keeping with their usual routine, they planned to meet up with 19-year-old Brian Boone, who resided with his uncle only a stone's throw from the lake. The happy-go-lucky trio, who had always been as thick as thieves, had every intention of enjoying a leisurely afternoon basking in the sun, stopping periodically to cool off in the pristine water. What they didn't know as they grabbed their gear and headed to the shore was that their lives, so full of promise and hope for the future, were about to end in a flurry of violence that none of them had seen coming. At some point during their lazy day, a stranger happened upon the group of friends, all of whom were described by those who knew them well as the cream of the crop. Since the person responsible for the carnage that had ensued as a result of that fateful encounter chose to keep the details of his depravity to himself, it was up to police investigators to piece together the tragic events that unfolded in the slice of heaven by the lake. From what authorities could gather, an armed man had approached the group as they lay on the beach without a care in the world. With malice on his mind and darkness in his heart, he had marched Brian and Gina into a secluded area where he shot them both, execution style, in the back of the head. Aware of the fact that what he had in store for Suzanne would require privacy, he had driven her to Barnwell Mountain Park, a recreational area located some 30 miles away in Upshur County. Once there, he had beaten, raped and sodomized the terrified teenager before strangling her to death with her own panties. When the threesome failed to return home by nightfall, their worried families went looking for them. After checking the places they were known to frequent and finding no traces of them, they had taken their concerns to the proper authorities. The day after the disappearances were first reported, a member of the maintenance crew at Barnwell Mountain Park stumbled upon Suzanne's nude body lying discarded in the brush. Not far from her broken form lay a pair of shorts and torn undergarments, which were later identified as belonging to the still unaccounted-for Gina Turner. The medical examiner determined that the teenager had sustained multiple blows to the face and body during a prolonged and exceedingly sadistic assault. The panties that had been used to end her life were still tied tightly around her neck. The cause of death was ruled homicide. Although the area where the body was discovered had been cordoned off and searched with a fine-tooth comb, there were no signs of Suzanne's companions, who were now listed as missing and endangered. 5 days after the gruesome discovery in Barnwell Mountain Park, Brian and Gina's badly decomposed remains were found in a canal just outside of our city, over 40 miles from Lake Hawkins where their ordeal began. Autopsies would reveal that the victims, who were positively identified through dental records, had died from gunshot wounds. If they had endured other injuries in the moments leading up to the shots being fired, there was no way of knowing the extent of their suffering. Since the scorching Texas sun had hastened the process of decomposition, forensic experts had been left with little to work with. Witnesses who had been in the area on the day of the murders came forward to say that they had seen a bushy-haired man, covered in a number of distinctive tattoos, hanging around the lake on Sunday evening. Besides the collection of satanic symbols that marked his skin, a flourish of ink across his chest had tagged him as a lonesome loser. One couple, Clifton and Denise Walker, recalled that they had been approached around 7:30 p.m. by an imposing figure sporting a shock of electrified hair who had demanded that they give him all their money. When they informed him truthfully that they didn't have $1 between them, he had threatened to take Denise in lieu of cash. Thinking fast, Clifton had offered the stranger a beer, which he had readily accepted. Seemingly satisfied with this resolution, their aggressor, who was now surprisingly calm, had retreated to his blue and white Ford Bronco and fled into the fast-approaching twilight. Having interacted with the person of interest in a triple homicide more than they would have liked, the shaken pair were able to provide details to detectives that proved invaluable to the investigation, including his license plate number. On Tuesday afternoon, a patrolman spotted a Bronco fitting the description of the one driven by the intimidating individual who had been harassing people at the lake on the day that Suzanne, Brian and Gina were killed. When he pulled the vehicle over, the unkempt man behind the wheel identified himself as Gerald McFadden. The Lonesome Loser ink display prominently on his chest signaled to authorities that they were on the right track. It hadn't taken long for law enforcement agents to determine that McFadden was an ex-con with an alarming history of attacks on women. Wearing his notoriety like a badge of honor, the rough character who was now in their custody informed everyone within earshot that they could address him by his preferred name, Animal. 38-year-old McFadden, who had a reputation for being as mean as a striped snake, had a criminal history that dated back to 1966 when he was arrested for burglary at the age of 18. A 7th grade dropout, it was apparent that he had decided early on that a life of crime suited him just fine. In 1973, McFadden pleaded guilty to raping a 14-year-old girl the year before. He also confessed to doing the same to a junior high school teacher just prior to his arrest. During the penalty phase of the proceedings, a judge sentenced the remorseless McFadden to 15 years behind bars. In a maddening travesty of justice that would soon become a pattern, he was back on the streets in less than 6. McFadden, who would choose wrong over right at every turn, had no more than cleared the prison doors before he reverted to his old ways. In 1979, only weeks after his release, he had kidnapped, raped, and sodomized an 18-year-old office worker at knife point. It wasn't lost on detectives working the Lake Hawkins murders that the 1979 attack was eerily similar to the one perpetrated on Suzanne Harrison. The only difference being that the victim in the earlier incident had survived. As punishment for his brutality, McFadden had once again received the pat sentence of 15 years. In spite of his history of violence, he was back out on the streets in less than half that time. McFadden, who had shown time and again that he was an ongoing threat who had no intention of changing his ways, was freed in 1985 when the state of Texas implemented a sweeping early release program that allowed even the most violent of criminals to leave the confines of prison in order to make room for an influx of new offenders. He was still on parole when the murders at the lake took place. On a side note, it was also during this period of purging that convicted triple murderer Kenneth McDuff was integrated back into society, where he wasted no time torturing, raping and killing at least 7 women before being captured with the help of the television show America's Most Wanted. McFadden, who had been employed on and off as a lineman for the telephone company when he wasn't paying his numerous debts to society, denied having anything to do with the abductions and subsequent murders of Suzanne, Brian, and Gina. While the divorced father of 2 admitted that he often camped near Lake Hawkins, he claimed that he had no recollection of ever seeing the victims. He added that, on the off chance that he had spoken to them in passing, he hadn't done them any harm. Convinced that he was lying through his teeth, detectives, with the blessing of the district attorney, charged McFadden with the kidnapping, sexual assault and murder of Suzanne Harrison. Since semen stains found on her underwear matched samples taken from the suspect, authorities felt that hers was the case they stood the best chance of winning. In a move that disappointed the victims' families, the state chose not to charge McFadden with the murders of Brian and Gina, citing a lack of physical evidence. Even so, investigators made it known that they believe wholeheartedly in his guilt, they simply couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. On July 9, 1986, only weeks after his arrest, McFadden escaped from custody, using a young deputy who was working dispatch as a human shield. Once they were safely outside of the jailhouse walls, he had forced his hostage, 24-year-old Rosalie Williams, to drive to a remote location where he felt confident they would never be found. 28 hours into the ordeal, Williams managed to escape from the railroad boxcar that had become her makeshift prison. The following morning, McFadden was apprehended and returned to jail, where he was kept under constant surveillance while he awaited his day in court. McFadden's trial got underway in the summer of 1987. In a lucky break for the prosecution, the presiding judge had ruled during a pretrial hearing that they would be allowed to present evidence of the defendant's past arrests, most of which involved crimes of a sexual nature against women. The decision was a devastating blow to the defense, who would face an uphill battle convincing a jury that the accused wasn't a predator that needed to be wiped off the face of the earth. McFadden's court-appointed attorney argued that his client was an innocent man who shouldn't be judged by his past misdeeds. He maintained that the fact that Suzanne's murder matched McFadden's modus operandi was nothing more than coincidence. That he was known to haunt the area where she and her friends were last seen alive was, according to his legal team, mere happenstance. In keeping with this position, the defense put forth the notion that the real killers were still on the loose and could strike again at any time. To back up this claim, they pointed to the sworn statement of an alleged eyewitness who said they had seen a disheveled hitchhiker covered in abrasions lurking around the lake on the day of the murders. Unfortunately for McFadden, no one else had seen the elusive red herring, and his whereabouts, if he did indeed exist, were never determined. After carefully pondering 2.5 weeks of testimony, the jury found Gerald McFadden guilty on all counts and recommended that he be put to death for his crimes. During the penalty phase, the convicted murderer's teenage daughter had taken the stand to beg for mercy on her father's behalf. Likening the death penalty to state-sanctioned murder, she had condemned the practice as barbaric. Unmoved by the girl's impassioned plea, the judge agreed with the jury. In July of 1987, he ordered that McFadden die by lethal injection. While this may not have been what his handful of supporters wanted to hear, the greater community breathed a collective sigh of relief. Even though observers had felt a pang of sympathy for the condemned man's daughter, they couldn't forget that Suzanne, who had only wanted to spend the day sunbathing with friends, had been returned to her family in a body bag. In an interview conducted after the verdict was rendered, prosecutor Stephen Tokoli described McFadden as a scary individual whose penchant for evil had known no bounds. A repeat offender whose crimes had grown progressively violent over the years, finally culminating in murder, Tokoli felt certain that the rabid animal would have kept on killing for as long as time allowed. On October 14, 1999, with the last of his appeals exhausted, Gerald "Animal" McFadden was put to death in Huntsville Unit, where he had been housed for over a decade. Suzanne's mother and brother were on hand to witness the man, whose murderous ways had forever altered the course of their lives, pay the ultimate price for his senseless acts of violence. When asked if he wished to give a final statement as the minutes of his life ticked down, McFadden had chosen to remain silent. Despite the fact that he had only moments to live and nothing to lose, he had refused to acknowledge his crimes or apologize for his actions. In February of 2019, a decade after McFadden had lain down before his executioners, his DNA was matched to a cold case that detectives were working on in Portland, Oregon. The details of the incident involved the horrific rape and murder of 20-year-old Anna Marie Lafka, who had been discovered deceased in her apartment on July 24, 1979, with an electrical cord wrapped around her neck. With the advent of DNA technology still years away, the perpetrator managed to elude capture and the case was filed away to gather dust. It was only when McFadden's samples were entered into the national database that Anna Marie's killer was finally exposed. Those left behind to mourn the victims whose lives were cut short by a chance encounter with evil, wept not only for the tragic loss of their loved ones, but also the futures they would never see. Suzanne, whose murder had finally taken McFadden out of commission for good, had been a member of the Honor Society in high school. The popular cheerleader whose academic gifts couldn't be denied, loved children and had planned to pursue a career in the field of education before fate stepped in and took it all away. Brian was said to have been down to earth and friendly to everyone, regardless of their social status or level of popularity. An all-rounder who was captain of the football team, he was also an avid reader who drank in knowledge at every opportunity. Gina, the eldest of the friend group at 20, had been valedictorian of her graduating class. A natural-born caregiver, she was studying to be a registered nurse at the time of her death. Anna Marie Lafka was engaged to be married when McFadden targeted her. A quiet sort who wouldn't harm a fly, she had always prided herself on staying out of trouble. Unfortunately, trouble found her anyway. For those who knew and loved the innocent souls who had the misfortune of crossing McFadden's path, nothing can ever make things right. If there is any silver lining to be found in this tragic tale, it lies in the knowledge that their killer paid for his crimes with his life, making the world a safer place for everyone. In 1991, a 35-year-old illegal sex worker from Michigan shattered a long-held myth about serial murder when she confessed to killing 7 men in Florida over the course of a year. For decades, the gruesome crimes of such repeat killers as Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and David Berkowitz seemed to establish a basic profile of the serial killer as white, often motivated by sexual dysfunction, and exclusively male. Aileen Carol Wuornos proved that serial murder is an equal opportunity terror. Labeled America's first female serial killer by a press motivated by sensationalism and exploitation, Wuornos was unique in the annals of crime. Famed FBI profiler Robert K. Ressler, the man credited with coining the term serial killer as well as establishing the patterns found in serial murder, described Wuornos as an anomaly in his extensive research. Only one female has been arrested and accused as a serial killer, Aileen Wuornos in Florida, Ressler writes in his 1992 book Whoever Fights Monsters. Women do commit multiple murders, of course, but they tend to do so in a spree, and not sequentially as is the pattern with men. One aspect of Wuornos' life, however, was all too typical among her male counterparts. Like Henry Lee Lucas, Charles Manson, and Richard Ramirez, she witnessed and experienced unimaginable abuse and violence in childhood. Ultimately, she slipped through every societal safety net and turned to crime out of desperation and to murder out of sheer anger. This is the horrifying, true story of Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Carol Wuornos, known as Lee to her friends, was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, via biography. As detailed in Lethal Intent by Sue Russell, Wuornos spent the first decade of her life believing that her grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos, were her birth parents. In truth, Aileen and her brother Keith were the children of Lori and Britta's daughter Diane. In 1953, Diane, then just 14, married 17-year-old Leo Pittman. 10 months later, their first child, a boy they named Keith, was born. The marriage was marked with abuse and jealousy. Pittman, bent on controlling his young wife's life, forbade Diane from leaving home while he worked a variety of jobs, ranging from gardening to making chrome car bumpers. Pittman was also a petty thief who graduated to more serious crimes. Arrested for auto theft, Pittman was given the choice between jail time and enlisting in the Army. He left for basic training in 1955. With Pittman away, Diane, already pregnant with Aileen, filed for divorce. When Aileen was 2, Diane Wuornos abandoned her children, leaving them in the care of friends. Lori and Britta Wuornos soon adopted Aileen and Keith and rarely spoke of Diane, considering her the family's shame. After several rebuffed attempts at rejoining her family, Diane Wuornos would remarry and have 2 more children. Leo Pittman, who never had any contact with his daughter, returned to crime after his stint in the Army. A convicted sex offender, he committed suicide in prison. According to author Sue Russell in Lethal Intent, Lori and Britta Wuornos exuded an appearance of decency and propriety in their suburban community of Troy, Michigan. The son of Finnish immigrants, auto worker Lori Wuornos was a firm and formal disciplinarian, a typical trait of 1950s fathers. His wife, Britta, was a loving mother to children Lori and Barry Wuornos, who would later romanticize their childhoods as idyllic. However, life for Aileen and Keith Wuornos in their grandparents' home was anything but ideal. For Aileen in particular, it was a nightmare. Lori Wuornos was a hard drinker who held his children's lives, especially those of his daughters, in an iron grip. As if to take out his anger with what he regarded as daughter Diane Wuornos' rebellion, Lori made young Aileen the focus of his rage. Aileen suffered frequent beatings from her grandfather. As detailed in On a Killing Day, by Dolores Kennedy, an infraction as small as forgetting to call Lori sir resulted in violent lashings with a belt. Aileen would also claim and later deny that her grandfather sexually abused her. An outcast among her peers, Aileen was trading sex for pocket change and cigarettes by age 12. At 14, Aileen Wuornos became pregnant. Although never positively identified, it has been alleged that the father was a friend of Lori Wuornos. Expelled from the family home, Aileen gave birth in a home for unwed mothers in Detroit, and the child was put up for adoption. Following the birth of her child, 15-year-old Aileen Wuornos was allowed, if not accepted, back into her family's home. The pregnancy had embittered an already volatile teenager. After that, she always said, "All men are out to use women," Wuornos' sister Lori Wuornos-Grody told the press at the time of her murder trial. She said she hated men. She was very angry, via On a Killing Day, by Dolores Kennedy. Resigned to life in a loveless home, Aileen Wuornos initially complied with her grandparents' rules, but lingering resentment soon drove her away again. Having returned to high school, Wuornos dropped out after a few months. Soon after, she wound up in a juvenile detention center. As detailed in Lethal Intent by Sue Russell, Grody suspected that her time in the reformatory would only make Aileen's behavior worse. While detained, Wuornos became adept at the game of pool. Later in life, Wuornos' skills with a cue would serve her well as a shrewd pool hustler. After her stint in juvenile hall, Wuornos again returned to the Wuornos home, but after several attempts at running away, her grandfather forbade her to return. Homeless, she turned to illegal sex work and theft to support herself. Sleeping in the woods or in abandoned cars by night, she spent her days hitchhiking, drinking, and using drugs. She was unloved, unwanted, and always in the way, and I think it gave her one hell of a chip on her shoulder, neighbor Jean Keir told author Sue Russell. By the age of 18, Aileen Wuornos had graduated from truancy, petty theft, and shoplifting to burglary and more serious crimes with greater consequences. As detailed by Michael Reynolds in his 2004 book Dead Ends, Wuornos' adult rap sheet outlined the life of a violent troublemaker on her way to becoming a career criminal. In 1974, Wuornos was picked up by the police in Jefferson County, Colorado. Using the alias Sandra Beatrice Kretsch, Wuornos was charged with disorderly conduct, driving under the influence, and, in a bit of ominous foreshadowing, firing a .22 caliber pistol from the window of a moving vehicle. 2 years later, she was arrested by Antrim County, Michigan, police for simple assault and disturbing the peace. At that time, she was also wanted for consuming alcohol in a vehicle and driving without a license. On May 20, 1981, Aileen Wuornos was arrested for the armed robbery of a convenience store in Edgewater, Florida. That crime landed her in a Florida prison for a year. Nevertheless, Wuornos was back to her criminal ways by 1984, when she was arrested for passing forged checks. Arrests for grand theft auto, illegal weapons possession, weapons theft, and multiple instances of assault and battery marked Wuornos' police record throughout the 1980s. Wuornos would attempt to use a number of aliases to cover her tracks. Also known as Susan Blahovec, Lee Blahovec, and Cami Green, Wuornos even resorted to co-opting her sister Lori Grody's identity. After years of living as a transient and supporting herself as a teenager, Aileen Wuornos decided to marry rich, and in 1976, she settled for a 69-year-old Floridian Louis Fell, a wealthy retired businessman living near Daytona Beach. At the time, Wuornos had moved to Florida after a brush with the law and seemingly wanted to reinvent herself, according to biography. But the marriage didn't last, as Wuornos couldn't escape her past, and their personalities couldn't be any more different. As Fell tended to his yacht club, Wuornos was getting into bar fights, per all that's interesting. After an arrest, Fell had enough of her behavior. But all that's interesting reports that Fell had more reason to end their marriage. He alleged that Wuornos had beaten him physically with his cane, prompting him to file a restraining order against her. However, Wuornos once claimed the opposite had occurred. Per the Los Angeles Times, Wuornos said that Fell had beaten her with his cane. At any rate, an annulment soon followed, but Fell should consider himself lucky that it didn't escalate. This peculiar period in Wuornos' life was the subject of a prequel film to the 2003 biopic Monster, called Aileen Wuornos, American Boogie Woman, per ET Online. Aileen Wuornos had a string of failed and abusive relationships with men, and they had only served to reinforce her hate of the opposite sex. A marriage to a wealthy man 3 times her age ended after a month, writes Dolores Kennedy in On a Killing Day. Wuornos claimed he beat her with a cane. Her life as a hitchhiking illegal sex worker had hardened her. To Wuornos, men were only good for the quick cash she needed to survive. In the spring of 1986, Wuornos at last found the love she had spent a lifetime looking for when she met Tyria Jolene Moore at the Zodiac Bar in South Daytona. As documented in Michael Reynolds' Dead Ends, Moore was a regular at the Zodiac. A native of Cadiz, Ohio, Moore had fled her small, conservative hometown in search of more gay-friendly environs in Florida at 26. Wuornos and Moore hit it off immediately. From their first meeting, they were inseparable. With Moore's encouragement, Wuornos increased her illegal sex work to keep the pair in a rough but comparatively comfortable lifestyle of long-stay hotel rooms, booze, and drugs. It was love beyond imaginable, Wuornos would state at her trial. Earthly words cannot describe how I felt about Tyria. Nevertheless, at some point in their 3-year relationship, the couple had exhausted any remaining spark of romance. By the end, they had become little more than hard-living traveling companions. It would be Moore's testimony in exchange for immunity from prosecution that would send Aileen Wuornos to the death chamber. Aileen Wuornos killed for the first time on November 30, 1989. As reported by Tampa's NBC affiliate WFLA, Wuornos' first victim was Richard Mallory, the 51-year-old owner of a Palm Harbor, Florida, TV repair business. Mallory, who had been confined to a prison mental institution for 10 years for a 1957 sexual assault in Maryland, picked Wuornos up along I-4 near Daytona Beach. According to Sue Russell, author of Lethal Intent, Wuornos and Mallory enjoyed some pleasant conversation and stopped for a six-pack as they headed for Daytona Beach in Mallory's 1977 Cadillac. At some point, Wuornos admitted she was a sex worker and asked Mallory if he could help her make a little money. After discussing price, Mallory and Wuornos drove to a secluded, wooded area. Drawing a stolen, 9-shot .22 caliber pistol from her bag, Wuornos shot Mallory 4 times. After relieving Mallory of his ID and cash, she covered his lifeless body with a discarded piece of red carpet. Wuornos then drove Mallory's car home. She would tell her companion Tyria Moore that she had made a lot of money on the road and that some guy had loaned her his car. The facts of what transpired between Wuornos and Mallory are unknown. Claiming that Mallory attempted to rape her, Wuornos stated that she fired in self-defense. Although she recanted and reaffirmed her self-defense plea several times, Mallory's past has left lingering doubts about the motive behind Wuornos' first murder. Aileen Wuornos' next victim was David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker, via Tampa Bay Times. Spears' body was discovered June 1, 1990, in Citrus County, Florida. Wuornos fired 6 shots from her .22 caliber pistol into his torso. According to Dead End's author Michael Reynolds, Spears' autopsy report revealed that 2 shots had been fired into his back, indicating he was attempting to escape. The next to die was 40-year-old highway worker and rodeo rider Charles Carskadden. Carskadden, described in Lethal Intent as the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to help a stranded motorist, ran afoul of Wuornos on his way to pick up his fiancée. Wuornos shot him 9 times in the chest and stomach. The decomposing body of 50-year-old salesman Troy Burress was discovered next, 2.22 slugs buried in his chest. On September 12, 1990, authorities discovered the bullet-riddled body of Charles Dick Humphreys, 56, in Marion County, Florida. A retired Air Force major and former Alabama police chief, Humphreys was working as a child abuse investigator at the time of his death. Retired Merchant Marine Peter Seam's body was never found. He disappeared after leaving his home near Jupiter, Florida, for New Jersey. Seam's 1988 Sunbird was found in June 1990. Witnesses placed Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore near the vehicle before its discovery. Wuornos' last known victim was 62-year-old Walter Antonio. Shot 4 times in the back and the back of the head, the location of Antonio's wounds helped upend Wuornos' claims of self-defense. As detailed in Dead Ends by Michael Reynolds, Tyria Moore had grown uneasy with Aileen Wuornos' increasingly erratic behavior. The unusual stolen items Wuornos was bringing home for the couple to fence at area pawn shops unnerved her. Where were the electric razors, toolboxes, briefcases, guns, fishing gear, and watches coming from? Moore had her suspicions, but they were too horrible to contemplate. When they wrecked a stolen Pontiac Sunbird on a wooded road in Ocala, Florida, a panicked Wuornos had warned her to run because they were driving a murdered man's car. It was only a matter of time before the law came down hard on Wuornos, and Moore wanted no part of it. She certainly wasn't going down as an accessory to murder. Finally, in November 1990, Moore told Wuornos she was leaving Florida to see her family in Ohio. Meanwhile, the authorities were linking the 7 murders. It was apparent that they were dealing with a serial killer or pair of serial killers, and, to their shock, they were likely women. Police sketches of the women, dubbed the Angels of Death by the press, appeared on local and national TV. Soon after, Volusia County Police traced items belonging to murder victim Richard Mallory to a Central Florida pawn shop. The receipt for the stolen merchandise bore Wuornos' thumbprint. The hunt for the so-called Damsel of Death was on. On January 9, 1991, Aileen Wuornos was arrested at a Port Orange biker bar called The Last Resort. Using an outstanding warrant for an earlier Colorado weapons charge, the police were forced to keep any mention of murder charges under wraps until they could find Tyria Moore. As detailed in Dead Ends, investigators from Florida located Moore in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Assured that she was not under arrest, Moore explained that Wuornos had told her about killing Richard Mallory. At first, she didn't believe Wuornos, but the incident with the wrecked, stolen car further aroused her suspicions about Wuornos' activities. Claiming that she feared for her life, Moore neglected to alert the authorities. Back in Florida, investigators convinced Tyria Moore to help them get a confession from Wuornos. Moore would write a letter to Wuornos requesting that she call her at a nearby motel. On January 14, 1991, Wuornos phoned Moore from jail. Investigators would be present to secretly record the calls and coach Moore. After 11 tense and tearful conversations over 3 days, Moore was able to convince Wuornos to confess to the killings. At 10:14 a.m. on January 16, 1991, Aileen Wuornos, true to her word to Tyria Moore, met with Sergeant Bruce Munster and arresting officer Larry Horzipa in an interrogation room at the Marion County Jail. Taking a seat across from the officers, Wuornos stated, "Well, I came here to confess to murder." It was 1991, and Aileen Wuornos was in the news for having allegedly murdered 6 men and was being held in a Florida jail. Her image was printed on newspapers, and somewhere in Levy County, Florida, God-fearing horse breeder Arlene Prahl saw her photo and wanted to become her friend, details the Los Angeles Times. For Prahl, the allegations against Wuornos were beside the point. She believed that Wuornos needed an ally. Although only 9 years older than Wuornos, Prahl decided to adopt the troubled woman. Like Wuornos, Prahl had been adopted. But Prahl's act of kindness was mostly motivated by faith. She informed Wuornos that Jesus had spoken to her, motivating her to form the connection, as per the Tampa Bay Times. However, there were questions about Prahl's sincerity, with claims she was out for the money, especially since Hollywood had come calling with offers for rights to Wuornos' story, even by Wuornos herself later, via the Orlando Sentinel. But due to a Son of Sam law at the time that prohibited felons from profiting off their stories, there was no money to be made, and the adoption itself was conditional on Prahl's agreement to not exploit Wuornos for money. Prahl was soon the loyal mother Wuornos never had, racking up $4,000 in phone bills for constantly ringing her up and even visiting her in prison every week. Throughout her trial, Aileen Wuornos declared that each murder was an act of self-defense, via justia. Maintaining that the victims had solicited her for sex and then attempted to rape her, Wuornos claimed she shot her victims to preserve her life. The case, as presented by her defense attorneys, painted Wuornos as a troubled woman with borderline personality disorder and an IQ of 81. Despite their best efforts, the defense was unable to use Wuornos' mental state and capacity to save her from the death sentence. The prosecution constructed a portrait of a calculating, man-hating killer who, under the guise of being distressed and stranded, lured 7 innocent men to their deaths. As documented in Nick Broomfield's Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer, Wuornos' courtroom behavior and erratic, conspiratorial thinking helped sabotage her defense. Despite pleading guilty to 3 of the crimes and no contest to 3 others, a tactic that she may have assumed would save her from the death chamber, Wuornos received a total of 6 death sentences. Aileen Wuornos had two brothers, Keith and Barry Wuornos, and she had troublesome relationships with both of them. Keith was her biological brother, son of Diane Wuornos, and like Aileen, he was adopted by their grandparents once their parents were out of the picture, details Sue Russell's Lethal Intent. Aileen and Keith had a special bond in their new home since their grandfather, Laurie Wuornos, was tougher on both of them than on his own biological children, Laurie and Barry Wuornos. The siblings became natural allies, both unafraid to stand up to Laurie and his strict parenting, and often ran away from home together. But a darker truth connected the brother and sister. They had an incestuous but consensual relationship together. Aileen once told a friend that she had lost her virginity to Keith, who wanted experience before embarking on relationships with other girls. Aileen gladly obliged. Keith died at a young age due to cancer, and Aileen inherited a $10,000 insurance policy. As for Barry Wuornos, he was technically Aileen's uncle, 12 years older than her, and was less of a friend. Once Aileen was arrested for murder, he threw water on her defense narrative, which claimed she suffered abuse at the hands of her adopted father. Barry testified and said their family was a typical one, and although Laurie was strict, he was kind. Before Aileen Wuornos died, she was analyzed in prison by a psychologist, Wade Myers. He administered a psychopathy test. According to his later case report, the role of psychopathy and sexuality in a female serial killer. When it comes to the most cold-blooded female serial killer in history, the results answered some questions and filled in some holes. The Hare Psychopathy Checklist grades subjects numerically on 20 different behavior traits, including lack of remorse and antisocial behavior, details Psychology Today. The highest a person could score is 40, while the minimum score needed for a psychopathy designation could either be 25 or 30. Wuornos scored a 32. There were plenty of factors in Wuornos' early life that influenced her criminal behavior, a traumatic childhood and early abandonment among others, as Myers acknowledged in his report. But he determined that she also had a biological predisposition for psychopathy. Wuornos also tested positive for antisocial personality disorder and borderline personality disorder, the latter which psychologist Harry Kropp testified to during her trial, reports UPI. He believed Wuornos had a distorted version of reality that made her incapable of following the law, and his testimony was an attempt by Wuornos' legal team to prevent a death sentence. But when the choice was put in Wuornos' hands, she insisted she knew what she was doing all along. In 2001, she was adamant about receiving a lethal injection and waved away concerns about mental incompetence. And in 2002, Wuornos received her wish and was executed, per CNN. As depicted in Nick Broomfield's Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer, Aileen Wuornos' final days on Florida's death row were marked with paranoia. Wuornos professed her hate for men, the police, and the legal system while alternately maintaining and denying that she killed in self-defense. In her final interview, she stated that the police had allowed her to kill to turn her into a serial killer and that she was being tortured with sonic waves. Still, she said she welcomed death as a conclusion to a torturous life. On October 9, 2002, Wuornos' death sentence was at last carried out, as per the Sun-Sentinel. Strapped to a T-shaped gurney as she awaited execution by lethal injection, Wuornos made her final statement, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with a rock, and I'll be back." Like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, just like the movie, Big Mother Ship and all. I'll be back. The first woman profiled as a serial killer by the FBI, Aileen Wuornos was a source of constant fascination for the media. Until her execution, Wuornos angrily decried the exploitation of her story, as per the Chicago Tribune. Although she was given to flights of paranoid thinking, she was correct on this point. People were trying to get rich on her name. As documented by filmmaker Nick Broomfield, Terry Amore, the arresting police officers, her lawyer, and Arlene Prawl, a self-proclaimed born-again Christian who adopted Wuornos in prison, had attempted to sell her story to Hollywood or otherwise make a quick buck on their association with the case. As we conclude our exploration of Aileen Wuornos' life and crimes, we are left with a chilling portrait of a woman who became a symbol of fear and fascination. Her story raises profound questions about the interplay of nature and nurture, the limits of empathy, and the complex factors that can drive a person to commit unspeakable acts. Cesar Barone was a convicted serial rapist and murderer whose preferred victims were senior-aged women. Even the hardest of criminals found Barone repulsive and his crimes so inhuman and revolting that there was an exception to the rule among the inmates, that in his case, snitching on him was acceptable. Cesar Barone was born Adolph James Rode on December 4, 1960, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. For the first 4 years of his life, Barone received loving attention from his parents and his older brother and sister. But soon after turning 4, his mother fell in love with another man and left the family. Rode's father worked as a carpenter and struggled to maintain a balance between working and raising 3 children on his own. It was not long before he had a girlfriend, Brenda, who would often care for the children when Rode had to work. During that time, she developed a special relationship with Jimmy because he was the youngest and because he was the most difficult of 3 children to discipline. In March 1967, Rode and Brenda married, and she seemed to naturally glide into the role of stepmother. She had a good relationship with the 2 older children, but after caring for Barone for 2 years, she had developed some real concerns about his development. She told Rode Sr. that the child needed psychiatric care. Although he agreed, he never made the arrangements. Other than having to deal with disciplinary problems with Barone, life in the Rode home was going along nicely. Rode Sr. was making more money in his new job as superintendent, and the family moved to a new home in an upscale neighborhood. The children enjoyed their own swimming pool and visited Brenda's mother regularly at her ranch where there were ponies for the kids to ride. However, life began to sour after Barone started going to school. Brenda received regular calls from Barone's teachers in regards to his bad behavior. He was always stealing toys in nursery school. He was expelled from kindergarten because he was such a troublemaker. In the 1st grade, his behavior grew even worse and he began to threaten the other children, sometimes with knives, other times with lit cigarettes. Barone was so difficult to deal with that he was banned from coming into the school lunchroom. Brenda's attempts to discipline Barone failed. Barone's father dealt with his son's problems by making an effort to show him more attention. He would take Barone and his older son Ricky to play golf and attend sporting events. By the time Barone reached his early teens, he was out of control. He had become a regular drug user, often smoking pot and downing LSD or snorting cocaine. He regularly shoplifted, especially for beer, burglarized nearby homes, and harassed his elderly neighbors for money. The pressure in the Rode home became intense, as did the family arguments over how to deal with Barone's poor behavior and his obvious lack of respect for Brenda. Unhappy with the situation, Rode and Brenda separated, and Barone got what he had hoped for. Brenda was out of the picture. Without her constantly monitoring his behavior and reporting it all to his father, Barone's behavior grew even worse, as did his obvious disdain for women. Alice Stock was a 70-year-old retired teacher that lived alone, not far from the neighborhood where the Rhodes lived. On the evening of October 5, 1976, Stock called a friend for help. She told her friend that Barone had broken into her home, threatened her with a knife, and demanded that she remove all of her clothing. Frozen in fear, the elderly woman did nothing and Barone left without harming her. Barone was arrested and sentenced to 2 months and 11 days in a Florida reform school. April 1977, Barone was questioned and then released after he admitted to burglarizing 3 homes of elderly women who lived alone. August 23, 1977, Barone was arrested on another burglary charge, but released. August 24, 1977, Barone's fingerprints were found inside a home that had been burglarized near the Rhodes home. Barone ultimately confessed to 9 other burglaries and unlawful entry into 2 other homes, but only because the detective questioning him agreed not to press charges if Barone was honest. Barone, now 17 years old, never faced charges on the multiple burglaries, but he was arrested and charged with burglarizing the house where his fingerprints were found. On December 5, 1977, Barone was sentenced to 3 years in the Florida State Penitentiary. At the time, Florida had a system that allowed young, nonviolent offenders to bypass the hardcore state prisons. Instead, Barone was sent to Indian River, a low-level prison that was more like a reformatory and that had liberal parole policies for inmates that adapted to the environment, did their jobs, and behaved. At first, Perón appeared to be going along with the program. By the middle of January 1979, he was transferred to a low-security institution and permitted to work outside of the prison. If he continued on as he had been doing, he was looking at being paroled by May 1979, 7 months short his 3-year sentence. However, it wasn't in Perón's design to be good, at least for not long. After being there for a month, Perón was cited for failing to be at his assigned job and also suspicion of stealing money from the job. He was promptly sent back to Indian River and all parole dates were off the table. Perón quickly cleaned up his act again, followed the rules, and by November 13, 1979, he was released from prison. 2 weeks after Perón had returned home, Alice Stock's nude body was found in her bedroom. The autopsy report showed she had been beaten, raped, and sodomized with a foreign object. All evidence, although only circumstantial, pointed to Perón. The case remained officially unsolved. In January 1980, Perón and the rest of the Road family, including the ex-stepmother Brenda, were still mourning the tragic death of Perón's older brother Ricky, who had died in a car accident 3 days after Christmas. Ricky was the proverbial perfect son, a nice young man and a great brother to Perón, despite that they were opposites in every aspect of life. Most anyone who knew the Rhodes probably shared a similar thought that the wrong brother had died. According to Brenda, she said as much directly to Perón during the funeral but instantly regretted it. In an effort to make amends, she gave Perón a car that she no longer needed, a gift he readily accepted. A month later, Perón, now 19 years old, showed up at Brenda's home and said he needed to talk and that he was upset about Ricky. She invited him in, and although they did talk for a while, that was not the real intention behind Perón's visit. Just as he was about to leave, he viciously attacked Brenda and raped her, telling her he had thought about doing it for years. After the rape, he began to strangle her, but she fought and managed to escape to the bathroom. Perón left after several failed attempts to open the bathroom door. As soon as she felt it was safe to leave the bathroom, Brenda contacted her ex-husband and told him about the attack and showed him the bruises on her neck. Brenda and Rode decided not to call the police. Perón's punishment was that he would no longer be part of the Rode family. Their relationship was forever severed. Around mid-March 1980, Perón was arrested for attempted burglary. If found guilty, he was also going to be in trouble for violating his parole. He called his real mother and she posted his bail. Mattie Marino, age 70, was Perón's grandmother on his mother's side. On the evening of April 12, 1980, Perón stopped by Mattie's apartment and said he needed to borrow thread. Then, according to Marino, Perón attacked her, hitting her with his fists and then beating her with a rolling pin. He then choked her and smiled while he applied more pressure. She begged him not to hit her again and he abruptly stopped, took her checkbook and money and left the apartment. Perón was found not guilty of the attempted murder of Marino. However, he was not a free man. His parole had been revoked for the March burglary charges and he went from the courtroom to a jail cell to await his trial that was scheduled for the following August. In August, Perón was found guilty of burglary and sentenced to 5 years, but this time in a prison for adult criminals. Despite the judge's sentence, if he followed the rules, he could be out in 2 years. Typically, Perón could not follow rules, and in July 1981, with just a little over 1 year left before being paroled, Perón attempted to escape while working on a highway. He continued to violate prison rules over the next month. This earned him an additional year onto his original sentence. Because of the attempted escape, Perón was moved to another prison. It was decided that the best place for him was the Marion Correctional Institution. Perón was a troublemaker at Marion, just like he was at the other prisons. His infractions included fighting with other inmates, leaving his assigned work areas, and shouting obscenities at prison employees. He went from being categorized as a medium risk to the next highest level, a close or high risk inmate. He was transferred to the Cross City Correctional Institution and his new release date, if he stayed out of trouble, was October 6, 1986. Gladys Dean was a 59-year-old prison employee that had worked for several years overseeing the prison kitchen. Barone was assigned to cleaning the room where the kitchen garbage was thrown, and Dean was his supervisor. On August 23, 1983, Barone physically attacked Dean and tried to remove her clothing, then began to strangle her, but Dean managed to get the upper hand and Barone fled the kitchen. Barone continued to test the system, and during a search of his cell, pieces of a hacksaw were discovered under his mattress. Prison officials decided he was too high risk, and at the end of October 1983, he was moved to the Florida State Prison, which was considered in the world of convicted criminals as being hard time. There he received an additional 3-year sentence for the attack on Gladys Dean. Barone was now looking at being in prison until 1993. Had he behaved, he could have been out in 1982. This was possibly a wake-up call for Barone. He managed to stay out of trouble and was given a new parole date of April 1991. During his time at Florida State Prison, Barone's work assignment gave him the opportunity to meet and talk with serial killer Ted Bundy, who was awaiting execution. Barone, who was in awe of Bundy, took pride in their supposed conversations, and he liked to brag to the other inmates about it. In December 1994, Caesar was sentenced to death for murdering Martha Bryant. In 2 other trials, he received death sentences for killing Chauncey and Margaret. Ultimately, Caesar was sentenced to 89 years for the death of Betty Williams. After being diagnosed with a cancerous tumor in his heart, Caesar died on December 24, 2009 at the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, Marion County. He was 49 years old at the time of his death. Authorities were also investigating Caesar's role in the death of his former mother-in-law. Now that we've unraveled the haunting tale of Caesar Francesco Barone, let's move on to our next chilling narrative. Charles Ng and Leonard Lake rented a remote cabin in the 1980s near Wilseyville, California, and built a bunker where they imprisoned women and enslaved them for sex, torture, and murder. They also murdered their husbands and children. When the spree ended, police connected Ng to 12 murders, but they suspected that the real number was closer to 25. Charles Chi-Tat Ng was born in Hong Kong on December 24, 1960, to Kenneth Ng and Oi Ping. He was the youngest of 3 children and the only boy. His parents were thrilled that their last child was a boy and showered him with attention. Kenneth was a strict disciplinarian and kept a sharp eye on his son, constantly reminding Charles that a good education was his ticket to success and happiness. But Charles was more interested in martial arts so he could follow in the footsteps of his hero, Bruce Lee. Charles attended parochial school, and Kenneth expected him to do all his assignments, study hard, and excel in his classes. But Charles was a lazy student and received low grades. Kenneth found his son's attitude unacceptable and got so angry that he beat him with a cane. At 10, Ng became rebellious and destructive and was caught stealing. He disliked Western children and attacked them when their paths crossed. When he started a fire in a classroom while playing with off-limits chemicals, he was expelled. Kenneth sent him to boarding school in England, but he was soon expelled for stealing and shoplifting and sent back to Hong Kong. College in the U.S. lasted 1 semester, after which he was convicted of hit-and-run driving but, instead of paying restitution, lied on his enlistment application and joined the Marines. In 1981 he was jailed for stealing weapons but escaped before trial and fled to California, where he met Lake and Lake's wife, Clara Lynn Balish. He lived with them until Ng and Lake were arrested by the FBI on weapons charges. Ng was convicted and sent to the penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, while Lake made bail and went into hiding at a remote cabin in Wilseyville in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. After Ng's release from prison 3 years later, he reunited with Lake at the cabin and they began living out Lake's sadistic, murderous fantasies, killing at least 7 men, including Lake's brother, 3 women, and 2 babies in 1984 and 1985. Authorities believe the number murdered is much higher. The spree ended when Ng and Lake were seen shoplifting a bench vise at a lumberyard to replace one they had broken, torturing their victims. Ng fled. Lake was stopped in a car registered to one victim with the driver's license of another victim. He was arrested and, during a break-in interrogation, committed suicide after writing down his and Ng's real names. police continued investigating. They found the cabin in Wilseyville and gruesome evidence of the murders: charred body parts, corpses, bone chips, weapons, videotapes showing sexual abuse and rape, bloody lingerie, and a bed with restraints. They also found Lake's diary, which detailed acts of torture, rape, and murder he and Ng had performed in what he referred to as Operation Miranda, a fantasy that centered on the end of the world and Lake's desire for women enslaved for sex. Investigators also found a bunker built partially into a hillside with a room designed as a cell so whoever was in the room could be watched and heard from an outer room. Complete details of the tape's contents were never disclosed. Ng was charged in the U.S. with 12 counts of murder. He was tracked from San Francisco to Chicago, Detroit, and finally Canada, where he was arrested for robbery and attempted murder committed in that country. After a trial, he was imprisoned and, following a 6-year, $6.6 million legal battle, was extradited to the U.S. in 1991. Ng and his lawyers used a variety of legal tactics to delay his trial, but it finally began in October 1998 in Orange County, California. His defense team presented Ng as an unwilling participant in Lake's sadistic murder spree, but prosecutors introduced cartoons Ng had drawn depicting murder scenes in the Wilseyville cabin in details that a non-participant wouldn't have known. They also produced a witness who had been left for dead in the killing spree but survived. The witness said Ng, not Lake, had attempted to kill him. After years of delays, tons of paperwork, and millions of dollars, Ng's trial ended with guilty verdicts in the murders of 6 men, 3 women, and 2 babies. The jury recommended the death penalty, and the judge imposed it. As of July 2018, Charles Ng was on death row in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, continuing to appeal his death sentence. After delving into the enigmatic world of Charles Ng, it's time to delve even deeper into the chilling story of our next subject. Arthur Shawcross, also known as the Genesee River Killer, was responsible for the murders of 12 women in upstate New York from 1988 to 1990. This was not the first time that he killed. In 1972, he confessed to the sexual assault and murders of 2 children. Arthur Shawcross was born on June 6, 1945, in Kittery, Maine. The family relocated to Watertown, New York, a few years later. From early on, Shawcross was socially challenged and spent much of his time alone. His withdrawn behavior earned him the nickname Oddie from his peers. He was never a good student, failing both behaviorally and academically during his short time at school. He would often miss classes, and when he was there, he regularly misbehaved and had the reputation of being a bully and picking fights with other students. Shawcross dropped out of school after failing to pass the 9th grade. He was 16 years old. Over the next few years, his violent behavior intensified, and he was suspected of arson and burglary. He was placed on probation in 1963 for breaking the window of a store. In 1964, Shawcross married, and the next year he and his wife had a son. In November 1965, he was put on probation on a charge of unlawful entry. His wife filed for divorce soon afterward, stating that he was abusive. As part of the divorce, Shawcross gave up all paternal rights to his son and never saw the child again. In April 1967, Shawcross was drafted into the Army. Right after receiving his draft papers, he married for the 2nd time. He was sent to Vietnam from October 1967 until September 1968 and was then stationed at Fort Sill in Lawton, Oklahoma. Shawcross later claimed that he killed 39 enemy soldiers during combat. Officials disputed it and attributed him with a combat kill of 0. After his release from the Army, he and his wife returned to Clayton, New York. She divorced him shortly afterwards, citing abuse and his propensity to being a pyromaniac as her reasons. Shawcross was sentenced to 5 years in prison for arson in 1969. He was released in October 1971, after serving just 22 months of his sentence. He returned to Watertown, and by the following April, he was married for the 3rd time and working for the Public Works Department. Like his previous marriages, the marriage was short and ended abruptly after he confessed to murdering 2 local children. Within 6 months of each other, 2 Watertown children went missing in September 1972. The first child was 10-year-old Jack Blake. His body was found a year later out in the woods. He had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The second child was Karen Ann Hill, age 8, who was visiting Watertown with her mother for the Labor Day weekend. Her body was found under a bridge. According to autopsy reports, she had been raped and murdered, and dirt and leaves were found jammed down her throat. Police investigators arrested Shawcross in October 1972 after he was identified as the man who was with Hill on the bridge right before she disappeared. After working out a plea deal, Shawcross confessed to murdering Hill and Blake and agreed to divulge the location of Blake's body in exchange for a charge of manslaughter in the Hill case and no charges for murdering Blake. Since they had no solid evidence to convict him in the Blake case, prosecutors agreed, and he was found guilty and given a 25-year sentence. Shawcross was 27 years old, divorced for the third time, and would be locked away until the age of 52, but after serving just 14.5 years, he was released from prison. Being out of prison was challenging for Shawcross once word would get out about his criminal past. He had to be relocated to 4 different cities because of community protests. A decision was made to seal his records from public view, and he was moved one final time. In June 1987, Shawcross and his new girlfriend, Rose Marie Wally, were relocated to Rochester, New York. This time there were no protests because Shawcross' parole officer failed to report to the local police department that a child rapist and murderer had just moved into town. Life for Shawcross and Rose became routine. They got married, and Shawcross worked various low-skilled jobs. It did not take long for him to become bored with his new menial life. In March 1988, Shawcross began cheating on his wife with a new girlfriend. He also was spending a lot of time with prostitutes. Unfortunately, over the next 2 years, many of the prostitutes that he got to know would end up dead. Dorothy Dotsie Blackburn, 27, was a cocaine addict and prostitute who often worked on Lyell Avenue, a section in Rochester that was known for prostitution. On March 18, 1998, Blackburn was reported missing by her sister. 6 days later, her body was pulled from the Genesee River Gorge. An autopsy revealed that she had suffered severe wounds from a blunt object. There were also human bite marks found all around her vagina. The cause of death was strangulation. Blackburn's lifestyle opened up a broad range of possible suspects for case detectives to investigate, but with too few clues the case eventually went cold. In September, 6 months after Blackburn's body was found, the bones from another missing Lyell Avenue prostitute, Anna Marie Steffen, was found by a man who was collecting bottles to sell for cash. Investigators were unable to identify the victim whose bones were found, so they hired an anthropologist to reconstruct the victim's facial features based on a skull they found on the scene. Steffen's father saw the facial recreation and identified the victim as his daughter, Anna Marie. Dental records provided additional confirmation. The decapitated and decomposing remains of a homeless woman, 60-year-old Dorothy Keller, was found on October 21, 1989, in the Genesee River Gorge. She died from having her neck broken. Another Lyell Avenue prostitute, Patricia Patty Ives, 25, was found strangled to death and buried under a pile of debris on October 27, 1989. She had been missing for nearly a month. With the discovery of Patty Ives, investigators realized that it was a strong possibility that a serial killer was loose in Rochester. They had the bodies of 4 women, all who went missing and were murdered within 7 months of each other. 3 had been murdered within a few weeks of each other. 3 of the victims were prostitutes from Lyell Avenue, and all the victims had bite marks and had been strangled to death. Investigators went from looking for individual killers to looking for a serial killer, and the window of time between his kills was getting shorter. The press also grew interested in the murders and dubbed the killer as the Genesee River Killer and the Rochester Strangler. On October 23, June Stott, 30, was reported missing by her boyfriend. Stott was mentally ill and would occasionally vanish without telling anyone. This, along with the fact that she was not a prostitute or drug user, kept her disappearance separated from the serial killer investigation. Marie Welch, age 22, was a Lyell Avenue prostitute who was reported missing on November 5, 1989. Frances Franny Brown, age 22, was last seen alive leaving Lyell Avenue on November 11, with a client known by some of the prostitutes as Mike or Mitch. Her body, nude except for her boots, was discovered 3 days later dumped in the Genesee River Gorge. She had been beaten and strangled to death. Kimberly Logan, 30, another Lyell Avenue prostitute, was found dead on November 15, 1989. She had brutally kicked and beaten, and dirt and leaves were crammed down her throat, much like Shawcross did to 8-year-old Karen and Hill. This one piece of evidence could have led the authorities right to Shawcross, had they known that he was living in Rochester. At the beginning of November, Joanne Van Nostrand told police about a client named Mitch who paid her to play dead and then he would try to strangle her, which she did not allow. Van Nostrand was a seasoned prostitute who had entertained men with all kinds of particularities, but this Mitch, managed to give her the creeps. This was the first real lead the investigators received. It was the second time that the man with the same physical description, named Mike or Mitch, had been mentioned in reference to the murders. Interviews with many of the Lyell prostitutes indicated that he was a regular and that he had the reputation of being violent. On Thanksgiving Day, November 23, a man walking his dog discovered the body of June Stott, the one missing person that the police did not connect to the serial killer. Like the other women found, June Stott suffered a vicious beating before dying. But death did not end the killer's cruelty. An autopsy revealed that Stott had been strangled to death. The corpse was then anally mutilated, and the body was cut open from the throat down to the crotch. It was noted that the labia had been cut off and that the killer likely had it in his possession. For detectives, June Stott's murder sent the investigation into a tailspin. Stott was not a drug addict or a prostitute, and her body had been left in an area far from the other victims. Could it be that Rochester was being stalked by two serial killers? It seemed as if each week another woman went missing and those found murdered were not close to being solved. It was at this point that the Rochester police decided to contact the FBI for help. The FBI agents sent to Rochester created a profile of the serial killer. They said that the killer showed characteristics of a man in his 30s, white, and who knew his victims. He was probably a local man familiar with the area, and he probably had a criminal record. Also, based on the lack of semen found on his victims, he was sexually dysfunctional and found gratification after his victims were dead. They also believed that the killer would return to mutilate the bodies of his victims when possible. The body of Elizabeth Liz Gibson, 29, was found strangled to death on November 27 in another county. She was also a Lyell Avenue prostitute and was last seen by Joanne Van Nostrand with the Mitch client who she had reported to the police in October. Nostrand went to the police and gave them the information along with a description of the man's vehicle. The FBI agents strongly suggested that when the next body was found, that investigators wait and watch to see if the killer returned to the body. Had investigators hoped that the busy December holiday season and the cold temperatures might slow down the serial killer, they soon found out that they were wrong. 3 women disappeared, one right after the other. Darlene Trippi, 32, was known for pairing up for safety with veteran Joanne Van Nostrand, yet on December 15, she, like others before her, disappeared off Lyell Avenue. June Cicero, 34, was a seasoned prostitute known for her good instincts and for always staying alert, yet on December 17 she also vanished. And as if to toast in the new year, the serial killer attacked one more time on December 28, plucking 20-year-old Felicia Stevens off the streets. She too was never seen alive again. In an effort to find the missing women, police organized an air search of the Genesee River Gorge. Road patrols were also sent out, and on New Year's Eve, they found a pair of black jeans belonging to Felicia Stevens. Her boots were found in another location after the patrol expanded the search. On January 2nd, another air and ground search was organized, and right before calling it off due to bad weather, the air team spotted what appeared to be the body of a half-nude female laying face down near the Salmon Creek. As they went down to get a closer look, they also spotted a man on the bridge above the body. He appeared to be urinating, but when he spotted the air crew, he immediately fled the scene in his van. The ground team was alerted and went in pursuit of the man in the van. The body, which was surrounded by fresh footprints in the snow, was that of June Cicero. She had been strangled to death, and there were bite marks covering what was left of her vagina, which had been cut out. The man from the bridge was apprehended at a nearby nursing home. He was identified as Arthur John Shawcross. When asked for his driver's license, he told the police that he did not have one because he had been convicted of manslaughter. Shawcross and his girlfriend Clara Neal were brought to the police station for questioning. After hours of interrogation, Shawcross still maintained that he had nothing to do with any Rochester murders. He did, however, offer up more details about his childhood, his past murders, and his experiences in Vietnam. There is no definitive answer as to why Shawcross seemed to embellish the stories of what he did to his victims and what had been done to him throughout his childhood. He could have remained silent, yet it seemed he wanted to shock his interrogators, knowing that they could do nothing to him, regardless of how he described his crimes. When discussing the murders of the two children in 1972, he told the detectives that Jack Blake had been bothering him, so he hit him, killing him by mistake. Once the boy was dead, he decided to eat his genitals. He also admitted that he anally raped Karen and Hill before strangling her to death. While in Vietnam, along with killing 39 men during combat, which was a proven lie, Shawcross also used the venue to describe in grotesque details how he murdered, then cooked and ate, 2 Vietnam women. Shawcross also talked about his childhood, as if using the experience as a way to justify his horrific acts. According to Shawcross, he did not get along with his parents and his mother was domineering and extremely abusive. He also claimed that an aunt sexually molested him when he was 9 years old and that he acted out by sexually molesting his younger sister. Shawcross also said that he had a homosexual relationship at age 11 and experimented with bestiality not long afterward. Shawcross family members strongly denied that he was abused and described his childhood as normal. His sister was equally vehement about never having had a sexual relationship with her brother. As to his aunt sexually abusing him, it was later determined that if he had been abused, he somehow blocked out his aunt's name because the name that he gave did not belong to any of his real aunts. After listening to hours of his self-serving saga, investigators still were unable to get him to admit to any of the Rochester murders. With nothing to hold him on, the police had to let him go, but not before taking his picture. Joe and Van Nostrand, along with other prostitutes, identified the police picture of Shawcross as the same man they called Mike/Mitch. It turned out that he was a regular customer of many of the women on Lyell Avenue. Shawcross was brought in for questioning a second time. After several hours of interrogation, he still denied having anything to do with the murdered women. It was not until the detectives threatened to bring his wife and his girlfriend Clara in together for questioning and that they could be implicated in the murders, did he begin to waver. His first admission that he was involved in the murders was when he told police that Clara had nothing to do with it. Once his involvement was established, the details began to flow. The detectives gave Shawcross a list of 16 women missing or murdered, and he immediately denied having anything to do with 5 of them. He then confessed to murdering the others. With each victim that he confessed to the killing, he included what the victim had done to deserve what they got. One victim tried to steal his wallet, another wouldn't be quiet, another made fun of him, and yet another had nearly bitten off his penis. He also blamed many of the victims for reminding him of his domineering and abusive mother, so much so that once he began to hit them, he couldn't stop. When it came time to discuss June Stott, Shawcross appeared to become melancholy. Apparently, Stott was a friend and had been a guest in his home. He explained to the detectives that the reason he mutilated her body after killing her was a kind favor he extended to her so that she would decompose faster. A common trait of serial killers is the desire to show they are still in control and can reach through the prison walls and still do damage to those outside. When it came to Arthur Shawcross, this certainly appeared to be the case, because, throughout the years when interviewed, his answers to the questions seemed to change depending on who was doing the interviewing. Female interviewers were often subjected to his long descriptions of how much he enjoyed eating the body parts and organs that he had cut out from his victims. Male interviewers often had to listen to his conquests in Vietnam. If he thought he sensed sympathy from the interviewer, he would add more details about how his mother would insert sticks into his anus or offer up specific details into exactly how his aunt took sexual advantage of him when he was just a child. Shawcross was transparent, so much so that the interviewers, detectives, and doctors that listened to him doubted much of what he said when he would describe his childhood abuse and his enjoyment of cutting up women and eating body parts. Shawcross pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. During his trial, his lawyer tried to prove that Shawcross was a victim of multiple personality disorder stemming from his years of being abused as a child. Post-traumatic stress disorder from his year in Vietnam was also ended up as a reason why he went insane and murdered women. The big problem with this defense was that there was no one who backed up his stories. His family completely denied his accusations of abuse. The army provided proof that Shawcross was never stationed near a jungle and that he never fought in combat, never burned down huts, was never caught behind a firebomb, and never went on jungle patrol as he claimed. As to his claims to have killed and devoured 2 Vietnam women, 2 psychiatrists that interviewed him agreed that Shawcross changed the story so often that it became unbelievable. It was discovered that Shawcross had an extra Y chromosome, which some have suggested, although there is no proof, makes the person more violent. A cyst found on Shawcross' right temporal lobe was said to have caused him to have behavioral seizures where he would display animalistic behavior, such as eating the body parts of his victims. In the end, it came down to what the jury believed, and they weren't fooled for a moment. After deliberating for just 1/2 hour, they found him sane and guilty. Shawcross was sentenced to 250 years in prison and received an additional life sentence after pleading guilty to the murder of Elizabeth Gibson in Wayne County. Death. On November 10, 2008, Shawcross died of cardiac arrest after being transferred from the Sullivan Correction Facility to an Albany, New York hospital. He was 63 years old.